Hello, everybody. Welcome here to the Wine with Jimmy e-learning channel. I am your host, Jimmy Smith. Delighted to have you on board. What are we about here at Wine with Jimmy? Well, it's all about an educational channel to help those of you that want to know more about the copious, complex world of wine. Wine is weird and wonderful, and it's great to understand it more. This is specifically designed for those of you that are really getting knee deep into your studies. Maybe you're getting overwhelmed. You need to bring it to life. That's what we're about here. So lots of wonderful visuals, maps, and added extras to give you a real wonderful overview of specific areas, topics, and so on in the world of wine. This is no exception. This video here is for the D3 section of the Diploma WSET on Spain. We are here looking at Castilla y León, the largest autonomous region in the north of Spain. And we are going on to series 3 here on Rueda. So we are heading down the Duero River, away from Ribera del Duero, and then on to Rueda. So we're going to have 3 videos here for Rueda. This part is really going through introduction, a bit of history and climate and grape growing. Part 2 on the key grape variety of Verdejo, and then part 3 on wine laws, wine business, and winemaking. Okay, let's get stuck in to the good stuff. Let's start talking about this rather important DO of Rueda. On the left-hand side, you'll see its geographical location in reference to the Iberian Peninsula. So we have circled it here. I'm going to start scribbling away here on the river of the Duero River, which starts in the Sistema Ibéricos, which is just here, so close towards Burgos, and then it meanders its way away east and then south through the Soria province, and then starts to go west as it goes through places like Aranda del Duero in the heart of Ribera del Duero, south of Valladolid, and then cutting through the north here of Rueda. So Rueda, the district, sits mostly to the south of the River Duero. Okay, so it's really important area. In contrast to Toro, which sits to its west, Ribera del Duero, which sits to its east, Rueda almost entirely produces white wines, whereas the other two are focused on reds. It is the largest exporter of whites from Spain. There's over 13,000 hectares here, and the Duero River, as I mentioned, cuts just through the northern part of the DO. We have 75 municipalities within Rueda. 53 are in the south of the Valladolid province, 17 in the western Segovia, and 4 in Avila. The latter two, by the way, Segovia and Avila, very famous for wonderful architectural things such as Roman aqueducts, alcazars, and also fortified towns and settlements. Now, the official status here was granted to the region by the Spanish Ministry of Agriculture on January the 12th, 1980, making Rueda the first official wine appellation in Castilla y León. An achievement followed several years of work by producers to gain recognition. I'll go through that in the history. The municipalities that I was mentioning here you go. So here is Valladolid, you'll see, Segovia, Avila, and we've also got a border here of Salamanca and Zamora to the south and southwest. We have the river running through the north, not far from Torre. Medina is quite important here historically, and I'll get to that very, very shortly. A bit more on the history then. So until about 50, 60 years ago, so let's say towards the middle and around the middle of the 20th century, Rueda produced oxidative fortified wines, a style which is no longer really favored by consumers in this area, actually all consumers at large. There are some that still follow on and produce this, and here's one here produced by the Carasfinas. This really lovely style, Bodegas Cachazo, as you see at the bottom. And it's a real great example of affordable, sort of almost like a dry Amontillado expression. These are made from Palomino, still grown in this area, but of course, significantly falling out of favor. And it's worth mentioning that, again, in terms of its importance. So Tierra de Medina, and I gave you the geographical location of Medina, this was a style of wine really quite highly praised and prized by Queen Isabella. That's in that picture. And in 1911, a royal order declared Vino de Medina to be a special wine, similar to those made from Jerez or Malaga. So a little bit after, of course, the Isabella days, but nonetheless, giving you that real grounding of importance and why we have still some Palomino vines in this area today. In the early 1970s, the Marqués de Riscal, that's the winery that we find in Rioja, correctly considered that the local Verdejo grape variety could make fresh, fruity wines that consumers were really starting to demand. And if it was really produced and manufactured correctly and handled quite delicately and protectively, we find that we can get a good expression of a fresh wine. So the gentleman here, the Marqués de Riscal, Francisco Hurtado de Amazaga y de la Garay from the Marqués de Riscal, was the one behind this in this picture. The investment in Rueda from this point was really the catalyst for the region's transformation, and many other producers followed suit. And this style of winemaking is really very much synonymous with this wine region today. So what about the climate here? So Rueda, of course, has a similar climate to Toro, which sits towards its west-northwest area, but also Ribera del Duero, which sits to its east. It's sandwiched in between and just south of. So we find hot, dry summers and then cold winters with generally low rainfall throughout. Rainfall, we've got to something like 400 to 430 millimeters per year. Late frosts are common. And if you have done the Ribera del Duero series that precedes this one, basically it's very similar, but just not as extreme. So we mentioned that regular, it could get above 40 degrees C in Ribera. Rueda pushes towards 40 degrees C in the summer months. Winter down to the likes of something like -10, but not as extreme towards the very, very low echelons of -20 from Ribera del Duero. Topography here. So we know that we have altitude. It's lower than Ribera del Duero on average because it sits down the Duero River. But of course, as we move from the river, we can go into areas that have hills and mountains. We're looking at about 700 to 800 meters in altitude. And this results in rather cold nights that help retain the acidity in the grapes. Okay. Next up is the geology of the area. So the bedrock, the mother rock of this area is limestone. We find a sandy clay sublayer and then a topsoil, typically, not always, but typically of stones like you see in this picture. So you'll either see sand or stony topsoils in the area. Now, most of these soils tend to be really free draining. Sand is, stones are, and limestone certainly can be. We have low organic matter, so the humus that we find at the top tends to be relatively thin. And all of this in combination reduces the vigor of the vines here. Also, take one of those soils we mentioned, sand. Sand is a soil that phylloxera just doesn't get on with. So in areas where we have a predomination of sand, you will find that you have no existence of phylloxera, so possibly some exceptionally old vines or really just a smattering of ungrafted vines in that area. Newer vineyards. So, of course, we will find newer vineyards being planted to vertical shoot positioning. And this goes hand in hand with the desire for grapes to be harvested at night, harvested quickly as well. And that's because we often want Verdecho to be brought in the coolest temperatures. So trellising and vertical shoot positioning, like this rather uniform vineyard that one sees here in this picture, that's what makes it possible, of course. But we mentioned, of course, that we have the possibility of some rather old vines, and the traditional way of growing vines here is certainly through bush vine viticulture. So there's a small amount of these old bush vines, and remembering on those sandy soils, and they count probably for somewhere around like 10% of the total vineyard land. And they are not being ousted because the quality of the fruit that comes from these vines is considered exceptionally high. Now, most of us have experience with Rueda. At the lower end, Rueda is very much about stainless steel, higher yields and fresh wines. But of course, these old vines make the types of wines that can go through lees contact and then possibly oak maturation, making these really rather rich, nutty and honeyed expressions of Verdecho, which are a far cry away from the larger volume stuff that you tend to find in many a place across the market. All right, well, that brings me to a conclusion of this first video for Rueda. I do hope they've enjoyed the information given here. If you have any comments or questions or concerns about what has been raised in this video, then of course, please don't hesitate to get in touch. You can do so by commenting on this video or of course, getting in touch via the Wine with Jimmy website. Otherwise, if you do want to go on and watch part 2 on Verdecho and part 3 on everything else, then you'll need to go across to that Wine with Jimmy website featured at the bottom and in the notes, because you'll need to go and subscribe for all of that extra exclusive content. Well, until next time, thank you very much for your time and attention. Take care of yourselves. I've been Jimmy Smith. Ciao for now. Goodbye.